Apache scout took in a stolen child, until he learned the boy carried his enemy's mark. An Apache scout found a dying white boy in the desert, and made the one choice that would destroy everything he believed about enemies and blood. The boy appeared like a mirage against the red stone cliffs, stumbling through the thorned mesquite with the desperate gait of something already half dead. Aiyana had been tracking a wounded deer for 3 days when he saw the small figure collapse beside a dried creek bed, his pale limbs folding like broken wings against the dusty earth. The child could not have seen more than 8 winters. His hair hung in matted yellow strands, and his skin burned raw by the merciless Arizona sun. Fever made his small body shake even in the blazing heat of midday. When Aiyana approached, moving silent as shadow between the rocks, the boy's eyes opened, blue as winter sky, but saw nothing. "Water," the child whispered in the white man's tongue, his cracked lips barely forming the word. Aiyana crouched beside him, studying the strange markings carved into the dirt where the boy had crawled. No moccasin prints. No horse tracks. Just the desperate scraping of small hands and knees, leading back toward the empty horizon. The scout's weathered fingers found the boy's wrist, feeling for the pulse that flickered like a dying flame. This was not his concern. The white settlements lay 2 days' ride to the east, and Aiyana had learned long ago that mercy shown to the enemy's children often returned as bullets in the darkness. His own sister's blood still stained the red earth near Canyon de Chelly, spilled by soldiers who showed no such mercy to Apache young ones. Yet something in the boy's face held him, not the pale skin or foreign features, but the way his small hand clutched a wooden cross worn smooth by desperate fingers. The same desperate grip Aiyana remembered from his sister's final moments, when she had reached for their grandmother's medicine bundle as the cavalry sabers fell. The boy's breathing grew shallow. Soon the buzzards would circle, and by evening there would be nothing left but scattered bones and the endless desert wind. Aiyana could walk away. Should walk away. The voices of his ancestors whispered warnings from the red rocks above, reminding him of treaties broken and trust repaid with blood. But his hands were already lifting the child, feeling how light he had become, how the desert had carved away everything but the stubborn spark that kept his heart beating. The boy's head rolled against Aiyana's shoulder, and he mumbled something that might have been a prayer in words the scout did not understand. "Quiet now, little ghost," Aiyana murmured in Apache, then switched to the broken English he had learned from traders. "You safe?" The words felt strange on his tongue. Safety was a luxury neither of them could afford in this disputed country, where Apache war parties and cavalry units played deadly games of hide and hunt among the canyons. But the boy needed to hear something besides the wind's hollow song, even if it was a lie wrapped in hope. Aiyana's hidden camp lay nestled in a narrow canyon, 3 hours' walk through passages known only to his people. The walls rose like cathedral spires, painted in layers of red and gold by 1,000 generations of sunset. A small spring bubbled from the rock there, sweet and cold, surrounded by ancient petroglyphs that told stories older than memory. He laid the boy on a bed of woven grass beside the spring, then built a small fire as shadows deepened between the canyon walls. The flames cast dancing light across the child's face, revealing more than Aiyana wished to see. This was no ordinary settler's son. The boy's clothes, though torn and sun-bleached, had once been fine. His boots were hand-tooled leather, now cracked but still bearing the mark of expensive craftsmanship. Someone would be looking for this child, someone with enough gold to buy answers and enough men to enforce them. As darkness settled over the canyon, Aiyana spooned water between the boy's parched lips, watched his chest rise and fall with the fragile rhythm of life, refusing to surrender. The firelight flickered across the ancient symbols carved into the red walls, spirals and handprints left by people who had faced their own choices between survival and compassion. The boy stirred, mumbling words in his fever dreams. Aiyana caught fragments, names that meant nothing to him, places he had never seen. But beneath the foreign words lay something universal, the sound of a child calling for family that could no longer answer. When morning came, The boy would wake in a world where his old life had ended and something new would have to begin. Aiyana stared into the dying embers, knowing he had already crossed a line drawn in blood and dust, a line that separated the living from the haunted. The desert had given him this broken child like a test from the spirits themselves, a question with no easy answers. In the depths of the canyon where ancient voices whispered from stone walls, neither the Apache scout nor the white boy could yet imagine how deeply their fates had already become entwined in the red dust and bitter history of a land that remembered every drop of blood it had swallowed. For 3 months, an Apache warrior taught a white boy to survive in the desert, until the child removed his shirt and revealed a scar that changed everything. 3 moons had passed since Aiyana carried the dying boy into the hidden canyon, and in that time, something neither of them had expected began to grow between them. Not quite trust, but something deeper. Understanding, perhaps. The kind that comes when 2 souls share silence and simple food while the world beyond their red stone walls tears itself apart. The boy had awakened on the 4th day with clear eyes and a hunger that surprised them both. Aiyana had expected questions, tears, demands to be taken home. Instead, the child simply studied his surroundings with the calm acceptance of someone who understood that home was whatever place would have him. Tahano, Aiyana had said, pointing to himself, then to the boy. Desatrat. It seemed fitting for a child who had survived where stronger men would have perished. The boy repeated the word carefully, his tongue wrapping around the Apache sounds with surprising ease. Tahono, he said, and something in his blue eyes sparked with what might have been relief at having a name that belonged to this new world. They learned to speak in gestures first, then broken words traded like precious stones between languages. Aiyana would point to the spring and say, too, for water. The boy would touch the flames and whisper fire in his white man's tongue. Slowly, carefully, they built a bridge of understanding across the gulf that separated their peoples. Mornings began before sunrise. Aiyana would wake to find Tahano already sitting beside the cold ashes of their fire, waiting with the patience of someone who had learned that rushing brought only disappointment. Together they would climb the canyon walls to watch the sun paint the desert in shades of gold and red, while Aiyana taught him to read the signs written in wind and stone. See there, Aiyana would say, pointing to tracks pressed into the dust. Rabbit, 2 days old, moving toward water. Tahano would nod, his small fingers tracing the faint impressions, learning the language of survival that every desert creature understood. By the 2nd moon, he could spot the bent grass that marked a deer trail, distinguish between the prints of friend and enemy, move through the thorn mesquite without sound. They shared their meals in comfortable quiet, roasted rabbit, wild onions, the sweet fruit of barrel cactus when they were fortunate. Tahano ate everything without complaint, even when the meat was tough or the roots bitter. Aiyana began to suspect this child had known hunger before the desert claimed him. The boy proved quick with his hands as well as his eyes. Aiyana showed him how to weave grass into rope, how to chip arrowheads from obsidian, how to find the heart of a fire by reading smoke and ember. In return, Tahano shared fragments of his own knowledge, how to tie knots that held fast in wind, how to calculate distance by counting heartbeats, small skills that spoke of careful teaching by someone who had loved him. They never spoke of the past. It hung between them like morning mist, present but untouchable. Aiyana sensed that Tahano's memories were wrapped in the same darkness that had nearly killed him in the desert. Better to let sleeping pain lie still than wake it with questions that served no purpose. But the boy carried his secrets in more than silence. He still clutched the wooden cross during sleep, and sometimes Aiyana would hear him whispering prayers in the white man's language when he thought the scout wasn't listening. The words came out soft and desperate, as if he were trying to hold on to something that kept slipping away. The 3rd moon brought scorching heat that made even a lizard seek shade. On an afternoon when the air shimmered like water above the red stones, Tahano began pulling at his shirt, the rough fabric dark with sweat. Aiyana was teaching him to track by scent, showing him how to distinguish between the musk of javelina and the earthier smell of deer. "Hot," Tejano said in his careful Apache, one of the first words he had mastered. His face flushed red beneath the tan the desert sun had given him. Aiyana nodded, gesturing for the boy to remove the heavy cotton shirt that had served as both protection and modesty. There was nothing unusual in this. The desert heat demanded such compromises from all who wished to survive it. But when Tejano pulled the fabric over his head, Aiyana's blood turned to winter ice. Carved into the boy's left shoulder blade, crude but unmistakable, was a scar in the shape of a cavalry saber. The mark was old, the flesh healed white and smooth, but Aiyana knew it as well as he knew his own name. He had seen this particular signature burned into the flesh of survivors, had traced its hateful lines on his sister's broken body before they laid her to rest in the red earth. Colonel Marcus Whitmore's mark, the butcher's brand. The world tilted sideways. The canyon walls seemed to lean inward, pressing close like the walls of a trap. Tejano continued sorting through the animal tracks in the dust, unaware that everything between them had just changed. His small fingers moved with the same careful precision Aiyana had taught him, but now each gesture felt like an accusation. How long had the boy carried this mark? How had he come to bear the signature of the man who haunted Aiyana's dreams with blood and screaming? Was this child victim or symbol, innocent or reminder of everything the scout had lost? Aiyana's hand moved instinctively toward the knife at his belt, then stopped. Tejano looked up, sensing the change in the air between them. His blue eyes held the same trust they had shown for 3 moons, the same quiet acceptance that had made room for unexpected affection in Aiyana's guarded heart. "Something wrong?" Tejano asked in his mixture of Apache and English, tilting his head with the curiosity of a child who had learned to read the smallest shifts in mood. The question hung in the superheated air like smoke from a signal fire. Aiyana stared at the scar, at the boy's trusting face, at his own hands that had held this enemy child with such careful tenderness. Everything he thought he understood about mercy and justice crumbled like old adobe in desert wind. In the breathless heat of afternoon, surrounded by the ancient silence of red stone walls, Aiyana faced a truth more terrible than any wound. Sometimes the deepest scars are carried by those who never chose their battles, and love can grow even in soil poisoned by the bitterest hatred. The scar on the boy's back bore the mark of the colonel who murdered his family. Now the Apache scout had to choose between love and vengeance. That night, Aiyana did not sleep. He sat beside the dying embers of their fire, watching Tejano's peaceful face in the fading light, while memories he had buried beneath years of careful silence clawed their way back to the surface like creatures emerging from winter earth. 5 years ago, Canyon de Chelly had run red with Apache blood. Colonel Marcus Whitmore had led his cavalry through the sacred places like a plague wind, burning cornfields and winter shelters, driving the people from their ancestral homes with saber and flame. Aiyana's band had surrendered rather than watch their elders and children starve. They had walked with empty bellies and bent heads toward the reservation, believing the white man's promises of safety. The promises had lasted exactly 3 days. Whitmore's men had come in the pre-dawn darkness, surrounding the temporary camp with rifles ready. The colonel himself had walked among the Apache families like a man selecting cattle, pointing with his gloved hand at those who would live and those who would die. The young warriors he shot without ceremony. The old ones he left for the carrion birds. But the children he marked with his saber before claiming them as trophies. Carved his signature into their flesh like a rancher brands his stock. Some he sold to traders heading south. Others he kept for purposes that made Aiyana's stomach turn sour, even now. Aiyana's sister, Ciala, had been 14 winters old, beautiful as dawn light on red stone, with their grandmother's gift for healing songs and their father's fierce spirit. When Whitmore's blade touched her shoulder, she had bitten her own tongue bloody rather than give him the satisfaction of hearing her scream. She had died 3 days later from fever and despair, the colonel's mark festering on her back like a curse made flesh. Aiyana had held her hand as her spirit fled, watched the light fade from eyes that had once sparkled with laughter and mischief. Now that same mark lived on Tahano's innocent skin. Aiyana's fingers found the handle of his knife, tested its familiar weight. One quick cut across the sleeping boy's throat would end this torment. Justice for Ciala. Justice for all the unmarked graves scattered across the desert. The child would feel no pain, would simply slip from sleep into whatever dreams awaited him beyond the stars. But when he looked at Tahano's face, he saw not the colonel's victim, but the boy who had learned to say thank you in Apache when given his morning water. The child who wept silently when he thought Aiyana wasn't watching, mourning losses he could not name. The small soul who had trusted a stranger's mercy when the world had given him every reason to expect cruelty. Dawn broke over the canyon rim, painting the walls in shades of gold and amber. Tahano stirred, opened his blue eyes, smiled with the automatic trust that had become habit between them. "Morning, Aiyana," he said in his careful Apache, sitting up and reaching for the wooden cross he wore around his neck. The scout's throat felt tight as rawhide left in the sun. "Morning, Tahano." They went through their usual ritual, sharing water from the spring, building up the fire, preparing the thin gruel of ground acorn and wild seeds that serve as breakfast. But everything had changed. Each gesture felt weighted with the knowledge Aiyana carried like a stone in his chest. Tahano sensed the difference. Children who had survived as much as this one developed sharp instincts for danger, even when it wore the face of safety. His movements became more careful, his glances more frequent. Like a deer catching the scent of wolves on the wind. "You angry?" Tahano asked finally, setting down his bowl half empty. "I do something wrong." The question pierced Aiyana deeper than any blade. Wrong? What had this child done except be born into a world that carved its hatred into innocent flesh? What crime had he committed beyond carrying the mark of his people's enemy on skin too young to understand its meaning? "No," Aiyana said, his voice rough as grinding stone. "You did nothing wrong." But the boy's eyes remained watchful, uncertain. He had learned to read the signs that meant abandonment, betrayal, the sudden end of whatever small safety he had found. His fingers clutched the wooden cross tighter, as if prayers could protect him from the storm he felt gathering in the air between them. The day passed in careful politeness, both of them walking around the truth like travelers skirting a venomous snake. Aiyana taught Tahano to identify different types of cactus fruit, but his heart wasn't in the lesson. The boy listened with desperate attention, as if perfect behavior might restore whatever he had lost without knowing it. When evening came, Tahano sat closer to the fire than usual, his small body tense with unspoken fears. The scar on his back remained hidden beneath his shirt, but Aiyana felt its presence like heat from a brand. Every Apache child who had died under Whitmore's blade seemed to watch from the shadows beyond the flames, demanding their due. "Aiyana," Tahano's voice came small and uncertain in the darkness. "You still my family?" The words hit like arrows finding their mark. Family. This white child, bearing the mark of Apache sorrow, asking if he belonged to the very people his presence dishonored. The cruel joke of it would have made Aiyana laugh, if laughter were possible with this weight in his chest. But when he looked at Tahano's face in the firelight, hope and fear warring in those blue eyes, Aiyana saw not the colonel's mark, but the boy's own wounds. Deeper than any scar, carried in the careful way he held himself, the desperate hunger for acceptance that no amount of food could fill. This child had been marked by evil, but he was not evil itself. He was simply another casualty in a war that devoured innocence on both sides, leaving only survivors to sort through the wreckage and try to build something resembling love from the scattered pieces of their broken hearts. "Yes," Aiyana said finally, the word coming out like blood from a wound. "You still family." Tahano smiled then, bright as sunrise, and settled back against his bed of woven grass. Soon his breathing grew deep and even, peaceful with the trust that had somehow survived everything the world had done to him. But Aiyana remained awake, staring into the flames and wondering if mercy was just another word for the kind of weakness that got good people killed. In the dancing shadows cast by their small fire, the Apache scout wrestled with a question that had no clean answers: whether love could exist alongside justice, or if some wounds cut too deep for healing to bridge the space between what the heart wanted and what honor demanded. When the colonel who massacred his family came for the boy, the Apache scout faced an impossible choice that would define what kind of man he truly was. The dust cloud appeared on the eastern horizon 3 days later, moving with the steady purpose of men who knew exactly where they were going. Aiyana counted the riders from his perch on the canyon rim. 12 cavalry soldiers in blue coats, their brass buttons catching the morning sun like scattered coins. At their head rode a figure that made his blood sing with recognition and rage. Colonel Marcus Whitmore sat his horse like a man born to command lesser creatures. Even at this distance, Aiyana could see the silver in his beard, the straight line of his shoulders, the casual arrogance in the way he surveyed the desert as if it were already his. The same bearing he had worn while walking among Apache families, selecting which children would live to bear his mark and which would simply die. Aiyana slipped back down into the canyon, where Tahano waited beside their small fire, stirring the morning meal with the patient concentration that had become his way. The boy looked up as the scout approached, and something in Aiyana's face made him set down the wooden spoon. "Trouble coming?" Tahano asked. In 4 moons, he had learned to read danger in the set of Aiyana's jaw, the way his hand moved toward his weapons without conscious thought. "Maybe," Aiyana said. It wasn't quite a lie. There were always choices, even when they felt like stones in the throat. "You remember what I taught you about hiding?" Tahano nodded, his blue eyes growing wide, but not panicked. Survival had taught him to accept instruction without question, to move fast when moving might mean living. "Find the cave behind the spring. Stay quiet until you come get me." "Good boy." The words came automatically, but they carried weight Aiyana hadn't intended. This child who called him family, who had learned Apache words and desert wisdom, who still clutched his wooden cross but trusted an enemy warrior's protection. What did the world owe such innocence? The sound of hooves on stone echoed down from the canyon mouth. Aiyana heard Whitmore's voice, sharp with authority, directing his men to positions that would seal off every escape route. The colonel had fought Apache before. He knew how cornered animals behaved. "Go now," Aiyana whispered, and Tahano melted into the shadows like smoke, carrying nothing but the cross around his neck and the trust that had somehow grown between them despite everything that should have made it impossible. Aiyana waited beside the dying fire, his rifle across his knees, his knife loose in its sheath. When the soldiers appeared at the canyon mouth, he didn't move. Let them come to him. Let them see that he had chosen his ground and would not be driven from it like prey. Whitmore descended first, his boots ringing against stone, his hand resting on his saber hilt with the casual confidence of a man who had never met an enemy he couldn't carve into submission. Behind him came 8 soldiers with their carbines ready, spreading out to cover the approaches. "Well," the colonel said, his voice echoing off the red walls. "Marcus Whitmore, United States Cavalry. And you must be the Apache who's been harboring stolen property." Aiyana said nothing. Words were weapons too, and he had learned long ago not to waste ammunition on targets that weren't worth hitting. Whitmore's eyes swept the canyon, taking in the fire, the scattered belongings, the signs that someone had been living here for months. "Where is he? Where is who?" Aiyana's English came out flat and cold as winter stone. "Don't waste my time, Apache. The boy from the Prescott raid. 8 years old, blonde hair, blue eyes. Goes by the name Timothy Morrison." The colonel's smile held no warmth. His father is offering a substantial reward for his safe return. Timothy Morrison. So the boy had a name beyond Tahano, a past beyond the desert's cruel embrace. Somewhere, people who shared his blood were grieving his absence, hoping for his return. The knowledge sat heavy in Aiyana's chest, another weight added to the balance scales of right and wrong. "Many boys in the desert," Aiyana said carefully, Most of them bones now. Whitmore stepped closer, and Aiyana caught the scent that had haunted his nightmares. Leather and tobacco, and something underneath that smelled like old blood. This one's special. This one carries my mark. The words hung in the canyon air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Aiyana felt his sister's ghost stirring in the shadows, demanding justice for the mark that had killed her as surely as any bullet. But he also felt Tahano's trust, the boy's desperate need for a family that wouldn't abandon him to the wolves. Your mark, Aiyana repeated, letting the words taste bitter on his tongue. A little reminder, Whitmore said, drawing his saber with the slow ceremony of a man who enjoyed the sound of steel leaving leather. Something to help him remember who he belongs to. Like all the others, the blade caught the light, showing stains that soap and time had failed to wash clean. How many children had felt its touch? How many innocents had carried Whitmore's signature into whatever darkness claimed them? But as Aiyana stared at the weapon that had carved his sister's death warrant, he heard something else echoing from the canyon walls. Tahano's voice, asking if they were still family. A white child's desperate hunger for belonging, for someone who would choose him despite everything that made such choosing impossible. The boy's not here, Aiyana said finally. Whitmore's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. Search every crevice, every shadow. Turn over every rock. When you find him, and you will find him, bring him to me alive. I want him to remember what happens to runaways. The soldiers began their methodical advance through the canyon, prodding behind boulders, checking every hiding place that might conceal a frightened child. Aiyana watched them work, his finger resting on his rifle's trigger, calculating distances and angles and the cost of the choice he was about to make. When the first soldier approached the spring where Tahano hid, Aiyana made his decision. The rifle shot echoed like thunder between the red walls. The soldier dropped, clutching his shoulder, and suddenly the canyon filled with the deadly music of men diving for cover while levering shells into their weapons. Take him alive, Whitmore shouted, but his voice carried the edge of a man who had just realized his easy capture had become a war. What followed lasted maybe 5 minutes by the sun's measure, but stretched into eternity by the heart's reckoning. Aiyana moved like water through the rocks he knew better than his own name, appearing long enough to send another shot toward the invaders before melting back into shadows that had sheltered his people for generations beyond counting. But 12 men with repeating rifles could pour more lead than one Apache with a single-shot weapon could answer. Eventually, inevitably, a bullet found its mark, spinning Aiyana around and dropping him behind the boulder that had been his final refuge. The wound wasn't fatal. Not yet, but it pinned him like a beetle on a collector's board, bleeding and helpless as Whitmore's boots approached across the stone. Stubborn to the end, the colonel said, standing over him with his saber drawn. Just like your sister. The words hit harder than the bullet. Aiyana looked up into those cold eyes and saw the same casual cruelty that had watched Ciala die, that had carved its mark into dozens of innocents for no better reason than because it could. She died calling your name. Whitmore continued conversationally, begging you to save her. Were you then, warrior? Here, said a small voice from the shadows behind the spring. He was here. Tahano stepped into the light, his hands empty except for the wooden cross, his face set with the terrible courage of a child who had already lost everything once and refused to lose it again. Timothy, Whitmore breathed, and his smile was like sunrise after the longest night. There's my boy. But Tahano, Timothy, whoever he was, looked only at Aiyana, at the man who had pulled him from the desert's killing embrace, taught him to survive, given him a name that meant something besides property and pain. You came back for me, the boy said in Apache, the words careful but clear, like family does. And in that moment, Aiyana understood what his sister's spirit had been trying to tell him through all these years of grief and rage. Some scars were meant to be carried not as badges of hatred, but as reminders that love could grow even in the cruelest soil. That children were not their parents' sins made flesh, but simply children, deserving protection regardless of the marks they carried or the blood that ran in their veins. Yes, Aiyana whispered, using the last of his strength to meet Tahano's eyes. Like family does. The boy smiled then, bright as morning breaking over the red canyon walls, and walked toward the man who had marked him, not as the colonel's property returning to its owner, but as Aiyana's family, carrying the Apache scout's love like armor against whatever darkness waited. Whitmore might take the boy's body back to whatever passed for civilization in his world, but Tahano's heart would always belong to the desert, to the red rocks and ancient springs, to the memory of a warrior who chose mercy over vengeance and proved that some bonds run deeper than blood. As the colonel's men bound their wounds and prepared for the long ride home, the canyon walls seemed to whisper with voices older than memory, Apache ancestors and white ghosts alike, all agreeing that in the end, the children must be protected, and love is the only weapon that never runs out of ammunition.